Hey everyone, welcome back to Shutter Magazine. I am Dustin Lucas and today I'm going to be talking to you about how to get cameras clicked in with color in Lightroom Classic. So when it comes to shooting with multiple cameras at an event, specifically here a wedding, when you're using multiple camera models, manufacturers, it's always difficult to get the colors to look right. Now, of course, on the left-hand side here, we have a Sony mirrorless camera. On the right hand side we have a little bit of an older Nikon D750, and the goal with both of those images is they're not supposed to look the same, but in the same light, with the same white balance settings in um, Lightroom, these images should look similar, right? The skin tone shouldn't look more red with the Nikon camera and more kind of desaturated here with the Sony. So we're going to go through how I can get these two images to look more similar in the same lighting just to create more consistency across the cameras. It's not necessarily an article to make Nikon cameras look like Sony's or vice versa, but the colors that are represented should be consistent. So when looking through your images, and of course when you're dialing in cameras on the day that you're shooting, it really helps to have the capture time synced, to be shooting in the same camera modes, whether that's both shooting in manual, both shooting in aperture priority. You want to be shooting, if you're shooting in custom Kelvin and you're creating that that perfect kind of neutral when you get started shooting, as well as if you're using Macbeth color charts. Those kind of things can be very helpful, but for wedding photographers, it becomes very difficult to implement a Macbeth color chart or a X-Rite color checker system within a day of a wedding. I mean, you'd have to shoot 15 or 20 color shots, create 15 or 20 profiles to really dial in color across the board. Most photographers don't have that kind of time or ability to control color and light that much. So a lot of times you're shooting in the same Kelvin numbers, or maybe just shooting in auto to keep it simple. But we're going to go through some steps on how to kind of dial in those cameras once you're in Lightroom Classic. So what it comes down to is choosing the right profile to start out with. That's the first thing we're going to go with. Adobe Color is the standard, but it's not necessarily always the right one. We're going to go through the camera calibration panel. That's where you can dial in RGB primaries, as well as how you want the shadows, to have, the shadows to be more green or more magenta. Camera calibration panel is where the profiles were originally stored. Now they're at the top of the basic panel, a lot more accessible for us. Then we're going to go through creating presets, custom Lightroom preferences to be able to apply these settings as your camera default. So what that means is every time a Nikon D750 or a Sony A7 comes into A7 III comes into Lightroom, those settings can remain default. So we'll go through how to set those in the preferences. So let's get started with comparing the raw versus the DNG color rendering and talk a little bit about color profiles. Alright, so now that we're ready to get started in Lightroom, we can look at the comparison of our two files here. So what I'm going to use is reference mode, so that way we can kind of compare them in the develop module and see them side by side. So here's the first shot, the Sony file next to the Nikon file. Now the Nikon file is a lot more green, a lot more warm overall. It's obviously because the tint is down to -12 and the temperature is much higher than our Sony file, which is a little bit closer to daylight balanced, a little bit cool, a little red, but we definitely want to get this image to look closer to this one. So in comparing these in the survey mode here, we can just kind of see side by side the DNGs. Now, the old rule of thumb with DNG files were to use these so that way you could have common profiles. That means that there would be Adobe profiles for any camera model when you bring them in Lightroom. So that way, if we wanted to go into the profile browser and we wanted to use any one of these Adobe profiles, there would be the same ones for the Nikon camera as well. So if we chose something like Adobe Portrait for both of these, it would help kind of dial in both of them. Well, that's not really helping here. And so the first thing we want to do to kind of help us dial in color is make sure we're working from the same white balance settings. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use zero tint and get this image to 5500 here, which will kind of help us. So this is just kind of basic predetermined daylight balance, and I'm going to do the same thing with the Nikon file. So as you can see, we're still a little off here. The Nikon file is warmer. To me, it looks a little more red in the skin tones, but we definitely want to get these looking a bit closer. I prefer the way that the Nikon looks, but what we're going to do is we're going to take the Sony file, which is a little bit cooler here, and we're going to take this and try to get the Sony file to look closer to the Nikon overall. So what we're going to do here is go back into the develop module, and we're going to pull up the reference option, and we're going to make the Nikon file the reference. So we can just drag that up here. Now we can click on this file to kind of compare and contrast the two of these files. So this is where we can see the Nikon next to the Sony, and we can start to dial these things in. So with Adobe Portrait, I'm not too happy with the way this looks. I think that we can get it a little bit closer, just profile-wise. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the profile browser, and I'm going to start choosing different profiles to see what I like. Now, of course, the Adobe Color doesn't look too bad in comparison, but I still think it's a little too warm and red in the face. So let's make sure. Let's see here. Just making sure that that looks good. And in comparing, let's see. Not sure if. Just want to make sure my file looks correctly. It was looking a little cool to me on the screen on the left-hand side, but maybe not. So what I'm going to do is I am going to pull back in the Sony file and go back into the profile browser and start clicking around different profiles. Now, the Adobe ones are averages. They work okay. I'm going to jump down to I'm going to choose Camera Portrait for the Nikon. I like Camera Portrait a little bit better. I'm not a big fan of the Adobe profiles, but the color matching ones are interesting. These are the ones that kind of try and match what's in your camera. And I think in my opinion, I think the profile for the Adobe Portrait works a little bit better than the Adobe Portrait. So I'm going to make sure Camera Portrait is applied. I like the way it's opening up the shadows. It's a pretty evenly lit image there. And that's what I want to make sure we're matching. Trying to get this to match the Sony file. So you see, we can see how heavy the shadows are, how contrasty this is. It just doesn't look pleasing to the eye. So as I'm going to do the same thing, I can go through the different Sony profiles, and I can just start clicking on them. Of course, we can see kind of the preview of what they look like here, but as we're going through each one, we can hover over them and kind of choose which one looks the best. Now, Adobe Portrait is just a little saturated, a little flat. What I like is the Adobe Light. Now the Adobe Light's taken the darkness on the face from here in our Adobe Portrait, just to show kind of a comparison here. Adobe Portrait there, all the way down to Adobe Portrait applied. With the light, it just brightens up the face just enough, and I think that those look pretty close. This looks a little saturated, and we can start to mess with some of the other areas of the image, but I think these are pretty close for what I'm looking for. So once I get the profiles dialed in, I'm pretty happy with these. Now, of course, if you're not happy with the Adobe profiles and you want to go with something third-party, something that you purchased, in the profiles section, there are different options for you to choose. So there's different ones in here that you could apply, like develop presets that would help you kind of dial in. Let's see here. Just quickly sync those two to kind of help us dial in. It's still the Nikon's warmer, but it kind of helps dial in to have a similar profile, so that way you could dial these cameras in a little bit closer. So third-party profiles are pretty nice to have if you've purchased them, but in this case I'm just using the ones that are available in the Adobe Classic uh, software. You can use the light and the camera portrait is what I'd use for these two. Now it might be different for the two cameras you're trying to match, and that's all part of the process. So let's jump into the camera calibration panel now that we've dialed these two in, and get working from there. So now that we have our camera profiles applied and we've done some basic panel adjustments here to get these images more closely matched, what I want to do is go into the RGB primaries and start to dial in how the colors are represented in Lightroom. So if I'm taking the Sony file here, the ARW, I can go down here to the calibration panel, and you'll notice that there's shadows where we can adjust to add some greens or magentas to the shadows. There's the RGB primaries, so that's the way that we can add some magenta to the red channel, or how the reds are represented. You can add more greens, if you feel that there's some hue issues going on with the overall image. Same way with the green primary. The way that this is working, it's a little bit backwards. Magenta and green going this way and that way for primaries for reds. For the greens, this is making the greens, adding more green there, adding more magenta if you want to kind of reduce the greens overall in the image. In the blue primary, you have your greens applied over here, more magentas there. And saturation is pretty straightforward, right? If I want to desaturate the greens, I can do that. But be careful. What's interesting too, right? You're seeing that you're desaturating the skin as well as these greens in the background. Much different than the tone curve to apply color changes. Like if you want to, for instance, come into the tone curve and do something to the RGB channels. Much different, right? This is kind of doing a little more color grading work when you're applying this kind of stuff. So you can mess with the highlights and shadows. And so let's put this back to linear. Same way if you wanted to apply like a kind of a warming effect. Maybe even wanted to kind of do something a little more split toning. That's what the tone curve would let you kind of do, something a little bit along the lines of that. Something kind of very specific. So what the HSL panel is going to do as well is it's going to do something completely different. So if I want to affect just the saturation for those colors in the background, I can grab that. Once I find the greens that I'm looking for, right? I can desaturate the greens altogether, so as you see, their faces aren't affected as much. Flowers are, everything green in the background, that's how you can do something. So it's kind of a big deal to see the difference between how HSL works, the difference between tone curve and the RGB primaries. So if I'm wanting to affect how kind of overall green this image looks, I can go into the green primaries and kind of desaturate that a bit. I mean, I could take it all the way down and it doesn't even desaturate it all the way. So if I want to take the greens down just a bit and I want to add a little bit of a magenta push, I can do that. And it's going to be subtle, and it's not always going to be so apparent what you want to apply, but that's the kind of difference that we would want to kind of go between the Nikon file and the Sony if I'd want to kind of tone down some of those green tones overall. Same way with the blues, right? So in his suit, um, I'm seeing like a rendering of kind of a blue cast, which is different than the suit here. And this is something that when you're trying to determine which option you should use between HSL and the RGB primary. So this is something that I would try and fix maybe with the RGB primaries first, and if I'm desaturating just a little bit in the blue, maybe take that down to -20. Don't think I necessarily want to mess with the tint of it. I'm happy with that. But if I take that down to -20, I can turn this on and off, and it helps out, right? Definitely helps with some of that cast. Now, if I want to get it closer to the way that this is rendered, probably would have to go into the HSL panel, which is kind of a good practice of knowing the difference between the calibration, RGB primaries, and using the HSL. So in that case, if I'd want to specifically hone in on just these casts in the suit, I can use my target adjustment tool by clicking there, clicking on the spot, dragging down, and it's going to desaturate those blues, right? So if I do that to a place where I think it matches this suit here, it's probably a little bit too much. And I can also mess with the luminance, right? So it kind of just helps to have these two compared, and now that I have those adjustments a little more dialed in, that kind of helps with the suit, and we can see it on and off. Subtle difference, but it definitely helps. Now we are seeing some blue cast in this suit as well, so if I do the same thing, drag it down, I mean it's going to find blues, and if I really wanted to like desaturate that all the way I could, but that just gets kind of funny. So there's like a natural blue cast in the suit, which I don't want to fully get rid of. But I think once they're a little bit closer, if I wanted to warm these images up, that would help with the blue cast as well. And the same thing in the shirt, right? So as I'm going in here, I might want to desaturate the blues even more. And I don't want to necessarily brighten the highlights in that. And so we can see the difference between the cast of blue in the shirt as well as the suit. That definitely helps. And so this already kind of has like a little bit of a blue cast too, so we could, of course, take this down. It's not going to hurt that. And that's how you'd work a little more localized, with kind of dialing those things in. Now you want to be careful that you're not affecting something that would be obvious, like the something in the flowers. So in toggling that on and off, you'd want to make sure we're not, messing with the greens or any blues, of course, in those. So getting color a little bit more close. I think that the shadow recovery on this image is a little too heavy, which we can take that down a bit further, maybe even darken the image just to kind of help dial these two in. But they're getting closer, right? This still has some warmer tones in it overall, so maybe we want to go back into the Nikon camera and the calibration. We can take the RGB primaries, we can take the reds down a bit just because it has a little heavy amount of reds already. If we zoom in on the face, just kind of toggling that up and down. I always try and help with 5 here. Take that down to -10. Add some magenta to the shadows, and that'll just kind of help. And you can see how subtle it's working. If we turn it off, it just kind of helps with skin tones there. Now overall, I think that the Nikon might be a little too red now, so now I'd probably want to take the hue and 0, take that down to 0. I think we stay right in that range. That looks pretty close. And again, this is all in Lightroom. This isn't using a color checker system. Now, this is a very manual process. Are you going to have to do this for every lighting situation, every time you're using these cameras? Of course not. I mean, there's different ways that we can save these settings for our images. So let's jump into creating presets, so that way we can save these settings as defaults for the cameras and keep things a little more clicked in place when we're shooting. So now that we're ready to create a preset, it's pretty simple to do. So if I want to create a preset specifically for the Sony camera, I can select that image in the develop module, hold Shift Command N, and that's going to let me create a new preset, right? So I want to check all settings, and there's going to be some things specifically you don't want to keep in a preset. Typically, white balance should always be unchecked. You'd want that to be as shot. Exposure is one that I usually uncheck as well, especially if I've been doing some editing. You typically don't want custom exposure settings applied. But all of these other settings, other than the graduated filter, radio filters, you want to turn those off. I always turn transform off as well. Lens correction's kind of a tricky one. For instance, if you're using lens correction, but you like to use custom settings, like you like the vignetting, but you want to make sure that the distortion is right, you wouldn't want to save lens corrections in your preset because it's a custom setting, right? You can set default, which works out well, but you'd have to do it per lens if you're changing things like um, specifically changing the vignetting and things like that. And so helping these two cameras out, and having that applied, if I didn't have the vignetting, I mean, that image looks much brighter than this one. So turning the vignetting off or kind of dialing it back, you might want to do that preference to what you think each camera looks like. But that's one thing you'd want to do for creating a profile is you would not want that to be applied. So I turn off white balance, exposure, graduated filters, transform, and lens correction. And then I could call this, this one specifically would be the Nikon D750, and I'd put that in my custom profiles or my presets would be fine, and then do the same thing with the Sony. So I'd have to create two two presets um, based on the camera model specifically, or I could just do it by brand. Brand would probably be fine as well, just to get something a little more generic. And then so I could apply those to any number of Sony files if I wanted to by just going to saved preset, my presets, and I can apply that Sony profile to a bunch of images selected in the library module. Now, so creating presets, pretty straightforward. The more interesting option that you can use in Lightroom is the camera defaults option. So in one of the newer updates for Lightroom Classic, they added the ability to manage these camera defaults in the presets tab. So your master raw default is fine to use. Use specific defaults per camera model. You can set that up here, but Adobe default is pretty standard. If I want to create more specifically, let's see here. If I want to create a camera standard default settings here, what I can do is choose the camera models that I have currently in this catalog, and I can choose the preset that I made called Sony A7 III, and then I can click create default. Now what that does is anytime that I take my image, and let's say I just kind of change it, turn it black and white, do some whatever I'm doing to the image, doesn't really matter. But if I reset this, it's now going to go back to my default settings, right? So what it does is it takes everything back to the specific profile and everything that I had applied. So if I have black and white turned on, I up the exposure and all that kind of stuff, and increase texture. If I hit reset, it takes me back to my default settings. It does not zero everything out. As you can see here, I've got all those settings saved. Now, the interesting part of that is when you're importing files, the biggest difference is you can import files with a develop preset. So if you want to import your files with the develop preset, you can do that. So that way that preset's already applied to the before image, before and after. But now, as you can see, this is my image as shot, and these are with the default settings applied. Now, these settings don't really make sense at the moment, but this is how I could apply default settings. So for instance, if I wanted to um, basically reset all of the tone, I have to go in and zero all these out. So if I wanted the camera light profile to be applied at default, which I can do, I can update this, update with current settings, and if I reset this, change all of my settings again, hit auto, and then I want to reset, it'll go back to now my default settings. Now it automatically updates the camera um, default settings because the preset's been updated. So it's a pretty big kind of tip between there. So if you're using this preset to determine what the default is, anytime you update that preset, it'll automatically update the default settings. So again, just to remind you the difference between how Adobe is going to bring this image in here, of course, with that as shot. This is how Adobe would bring in Adobe Color, all the settings at 0, and this could be our default, bringing it in. If I hit reset, it goes back to here. So that definitely makes it more helpful for dialing in the defaults per camera. Same thing's going to go with the Nikon. I'm across the board if I hit reset, and it's going to reset that image back to there. So um, that certainly helps get the images more closely dialed in, and for you to be able to save those settings per camera for default. So if you don't want to have to remind yourself what they are, or if you want to reset an image and for it to go back, those are different options. I, for instance, like to see the cameras directly into Lightroom with nothing applied. That kind of helps when I'm working in the develop module. More specifically, what I mean is working like this, like you can see directly at a camera and what you're doing to processing. But especially if you're working with multiple camera brands, manufacturers, it kind of helps to have this dialed in a little bit more. But that's it. So those are the results that I have in dialing in both of these cameras. Let me back these up a bit here so we can kind of see what these images look like in the end, and go from there. So there we have it. Everything's done, dialed in. We've saved presets, calibration settings. And I've gotten the Sony here on the left to look pretty close to the Nikon on the right. So again, when it comes down to dialing in or clicking in color in Lightroom, there's multiple different ways to do that. I think more specifically, you want to start with the profile and work in the calibration settings. That's going to kind of help the way that Lightroom is interpreting the colors from your image sensor, how they're coming into Lightroom, what you're seeing. Those things certainly help, but HSL becomes really helpful when you want to localize color like we did here on the jacket for the Sony, as well as you want to use the tone curve if you want to apply a cool kind of more stylized color grading to your images. But again, going from the profile to calibration settings, creating presets, all those things are going to help you, get clicked in with color. I highly recommend starting with this. And if you think that the Macbeth color chart or the X-Rite color checker system would be a better option for you, or your different kind of calibration tools to dial in, I definitely recommend you can explore those as well. This is kind of more of a more time-intensive option, one that you kind of have to do more manually in Lightroom, but I think it could be pretty adaptive. And so once I'm shooting with the Sony camera, I'd be able to apply this to all the images. They might shift a bit with different lighting situations, but at least this helps you kind of get started right out the gate between your two images. You could sync these sequences and kind of move on and create different profiles, maybe for daylight, for indoor, for mixed lighting and things like that, maybe even flash. Those kind of things would help. But I'm hoping that you've gotten something out of this. Above all, stop converting your RAW files to DNGs. It doesn't matter. The RAW files have profiles. Adobe Lightroom Classic can help you with the profiles. Choosing the right ones can kind of help you right out the gate get things a little more dialed in. But tune into next month for my articles as I keep diving into Lightroom Classic and for more tips for you. Thanks for tuning in.